My husband cheated with a girl from Japan on a business trip.
Hey Reddit, my name's Sarah, I'm 32, and I'm living through something I never thought would happen to me. My husband, Alex, 35, whom I've been married to for 8 years, recently confessed to having an affair with a girl he met on a business trip to Japan. We had what I thought was a perfect marriage, one built on trust, love, and years of shared dreams.
But now, everything feels like a lie.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened, and I feel completely lost. This is the story of how I discovered the affair, the emotional roller coaster I've been on, and my ongoing journey to rebuild my life from the seemingly perfect marriage to the ultimate betrayal that left me shattered.
Alex and I met when I was 22 and he was 25.
I had just started my first job as a graphic designer at a marketing firm, fresh out of college and excited to start my career. Alex was a rising star in finance, working as a financial analyst for a big investment firm. We met through mutual friends at a concert. Neither of us really wanted to be there, but somehow, we ended up next to each other, sharing awkward smiles and shouting over the music to make conversation. What struck me first about Alex was his confidence. He had this natural charisma, a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He was smart, funny, and had a kind of ambition that was magnetic.
We spent the entire night talking, laughing, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd known him for years.
He asked for my number before we left, and from that moment on, we were inseparable.
Our relationship moved quickly. Within a few months, we were officially dating, and not long after, we moved in together.
I fell in love with how passionate Alex was about his work, his dreams, and his plans for the future.
He was driven, focused, and constantly pushing himself to achieve more. I admired his work ethic, even when it meant long hours and late nights at the office.
He'd come home exhausted, but still managed to make me feel special, whether it was with a simple home-cooked dinner or a handwritten note left on my pillow. We got engaged a year later during a weekend trip to the mountains. It was perfect, a cozy cabin, a roaring fire, and a proposal that caught me completely off guard. Alex had planned the whole thing meticulously, right down to the playlist of our favorite songs playing in the background. He got down on one knee, pulled out a beautiful ring, and asked me to marry him. I said yes through tears of joy, feeling like I was living in a fairy tale.
Our wedding was just as magical.
Surrounded by family and friends, we exchanged vows in a garden ceremony that felt like a dream come true. I remember looking into Alex's eyes as we said our I do's, feeling certain that this was the start of a lifelong adventure together.
We were young, in love, and ready to take on the world.
The first few years of our marriage were everything I'd hoped for. We bought a cute townhouse in the city, decorated it together, and built a life that felt stable and happy. Alex's career took off, and he quickly moved up the ranks at his company, earning promotions, bonuses, and respect in his field.
I was so proud of him.
He was the kind of guy who always seemed to have it all figured out, and I loved being by his side as he chased his dreams.
My own career was also flourishing.
I'd started as a junior designer, but within a few years, I worked my way up to art director. I loved my job, and I was passionate about creating things that inspired people.
Alex was always supportive, celebrating my successes as much as his own.
We were the kind of couple people looked up to, successful, happy, and completely in sync. We had our routines, Sunday brunches at our favorite cafe, movie nights on the couch, and weekend hikes to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. We talked about everything, our plans, our goals, and the family we'd start one day when the timing felt right. Alex's job required a lot of travel, but I never minded. I was confident in our relationship, and I trusted him completely. He'd bring back little gifts from his trips, souvenirs that made me feel connected to his adventures even when we were miles apart. But as much as I loved our life, looking back, I can see now that the cracks were starting to show. Alex's work demands grew, and he began traveling more frequently, often to international destinations for high-profile meetings and client events. He was gone a lot, sometimes for weeks at a time, and though I missed him, I convinced myself it was just a phase. We were building a future together, and this was just part of the sacrifice.
Even when Alex was home, I noticed a change in him. He was more distracted, spending hours on his phone or buried in emails.
Our conversations felt rushed, like he was always half listening, his mind elsewhere. I tried to brush it off, thinking he was just stressed from work. I told myself that once things calmed down, we'd get back to the way we were.
I couldn't have been more wrong. When Alex told me he was going to Japan for 2 weeks on a business trip, I was excited for him. His company had recently expanded into Asia, and this trip was a big deal. He'd be meeting with important clients, attending conferences, and laying the groundwork for future business. Alex had always wanted to go to Japan, and now he was getting the chance to do it as part of his job. The night before he left, we packed his bags together. Alex was buzzing with energy, talking nonstop about all the things he was looking forward to: sushi at a Michelin-star restaurant, exploring Tokyo's neon-lit streets, and finally experiencing the culture he'd always admired from afar. I was happy for him, and even though I knew I'd miss him, I was proud that he was being given such a huge opportunity. "You're going to love it," he said as he folded his shirt into his suitcase. "One day, I'm taking you with me. We'll see it all together." "I'd love that," I replied, smiling. "Just don't have too much fun without me." Alex laughed, pulling me into a hug. "Never," he said, planting a kiss on my forehead. "You're my favorite part of every trip, no matter where I am." The next morning, I drove him to the airport. We kissed goodbye at the security gate, and I watched him disappear into the crowd, waving until he was out of sight. I told myself it was just another business trip. 2 weeks would fly by, and soon he'd be back home where he belonged. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. We stayed in touch through texts, video calls, and late-night phone conversations. Alex sent me pictures of the Tokyo skyline, the crowded markets, and plates of the most beautiful food I'd ever seen. He looked happy and excited, and I loved hearing about all the new experiences he was having. But as the trip went on, Alex became harder to reach. His texts slowed down, our calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, he seemed distracted. He'd blame it on the time difference, his packed schedule, and the sheer exhaustion of constantly being on the move. I tried not to overthink it, but there was a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. One night, Alex called me late, his voice sounding distant and strained. He told me he'd been at a work dinner that ran long and that he was tired from a long day of meetings. He was polite but unusually brief, rushing through the conversation as if he had somewhere else he needed to be. When I asked him if everything was okay, he insisted it was, but there was something in his tone that felt off. "Just tired," he said, sounding more like he was trying to convince himself than me. "It's been a lot." I wanted to believe him, so I pushed the doubts aside and focused on getting through the rest of the trip. I told myself it was just a busy week, that he'd be back soon, and everything would return to normal. But as the days dragged on, the uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger. Alex returned home from Japan, and at first, everything seemed normal. He was full of stories about his time in Tokyo, how beautiful the city was, how well the meetings went, and how much he'd learned from the experience. He brought me back a gorgeous silk kimono, wrapped in delicate paper, and I was touched by the thought he'd put into picking it out. But even as he smiled and told me about the trip, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing. He was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. He'd spend hours on his phone, often retreating to the office to catch up on work or make calls that I wasn't privy to. When I asked him how he was feeling, he'd brush me off, saying he was just tired from the trip and trying to readjust. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but the distance between us felt more palpable than ever. One night, about a week after he got back, Alex fell asleep on the couch while we were watching TV. His phone was next to him, still unlocked. I stared at it for a long time, debating with myself. I'd never felt the need to check Alex's phone before. Our relationship had always been built on trust, and I'd never doubted his loyalty. But that nagging feeling I'd had since Japan was eating away at me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I picked up the phone, telling myself it would be quick, just enough to ease my mind. I went through his recent messages, and that's when I saw them, a string of texts from someone named Rina. The messages were casual at first, updates about his day, questions about Tokyo, and photos of things that seemed innocuous enough. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. They were flirtatious, intimate, filled with inside jokes and shared experiences that had nothing to do with business. There were photos of Rina, selfies of her smiling, posing in front of Tokyo landmarks, and one of her in a kimono that looked eerily similar to the one Alex had given me. My heart pounded as I read through each message, feeling my world unravel with every word. I found texts about late-night dinners, drinks at trendy bars, and even a day spent exploring a nearby town that wasn't on Alex's work itinerary. There were photos of the two of them together, smiling, laughing, and looking like they were having the time of their lives. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't some harmless flirtation, it was an affair. The final straw was a message from Rena, sent the day before Alex returned home. "Missing you already. Can't wait to see you again." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Alex, the man I'd loved and trusted for years, had been cheating on me. And not just with anyone, but with someone he'd met halfway around the world. I felt sick, like I'd been punched in the gut. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage was suddenly in question. I spent the rest of the night in our bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of it all. I wanted to scream, cry, and throw things, but all I could do was lie there, numb and overwhelmed. I replayed every conversation, every moment of the past few weeks, searching for clues I'd missed. I felt like a fool for trusting him, for believing that our marriage was untouchable. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach, knowing that I couldn't keep what I discovered to myself. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I waited until Alex was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, looking so calm and normal that it made me sick. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. "Alex, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely holding steady. He looked up, instantly sensing the tension. "What's going on?" I stared at him, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. "I know about Rena," I said, watching as the color drained from his face. Alex set his coffee cup down, his hands trembling. "Sarah, Just tell me the truth," I interrupted, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "How long has this been going on?" Alex looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "It happened on the trip," he said quietly. "I met her at a work event, and we just connected. It wasn't supposed to be anything more." I felt a surge of anger. "But it was more, wasn't it? You didn't just cheat once. You spent time with her. You lied to me." Alex nodded, his expression filled with regret. "It was a mistake. I got caught up in the moment, and I wasn't thinking about what it would mean. I'm so sorry, Sarah." I wanted to scream, to make him feel the same pain I was feeling. "Do you love her?" Alex shook his head quickly. "No, it wasn't like that. It was just, I was lonely, and she was there. I never wanted to hurt you." His words felt hollow, like a script he'd rehearsed in his mind. I couldn't believe that the man I'd built my life with had been capable of such betrayal. I stood up, feeling the walls close in around me. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You've destroyed everything." I walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't stand to look at him. I couldn't stand to be in the same space as him. I spent the rest of the day locked in our bedroom, sobbing into my pillow and feeling utterly broken. I wanted to believe that Alex was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, but all I could see were the lies he'd told and the promises he'd shattered. The days following the confrontation were a blur of anger, sadness, and confusion. Alex tried to make things right, but I couldn't bring myself to forgive him. I stayed with my friend Lisa for a few days, needing to get away from the house and the constant reminder of what had happened. Lisa was my rock during those early days, letting me vent, cry, and fall apart without judgment. She listened as I poured out my heart, telling her every painful detail of what I'd found. I showed her the messages, the photos, and every piece of evidence that had ripped my world apart. Lisa was furious on my behalf, but she also helped me see that what I was feeling was normal, that it was okay to be angry, to be sad, and to not know what to do next. Alex called and texted constantly, begging me to come home, to let him explain, to give him a chance to make things right. But I wasn't ready to face him. I couldn't look at him without feeling the sting of betrayal, without picturing him with Rena and wondering what he'd been thinking. I needed space, and I needed time to figure out what I wanted. After a week, I finally went back home, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I needed to confront the reality of what had happened. Alex was waiting for me, looking more haggard and miserable than I'd ever seen him. He apologized again, telling me how much he regretted what he'd done and how he'd do anything to make it right. I listened, but I couldn't bring myself to believe him. His words felt empty, and no amount of promises could undo the damage he'd caused. He offered to cut all contact with Rena, to go to therapy, and to do whatever it took to rebuild my trust. But the truth was, I didn't know if I wanted to try. I didn't know if I could ever look at him the same way again. We started going to couples therapy, hoping it would help us find a way forward. But every session felt like we were just going through the motions. Alex would talk about his guilt, his shame, and his desire to fix things, but I was numb. I couldn't connect with him anymore, and every time I looked at him, all I saw was the man who had broken my heart. I threw myself into work, using my job as a distraction from the chaos at home. I stayed late, took on extra projects, and buried myself in deadlines and creative briefs. It was easier to focus on work than to deal with the mess that my personal life had become. But even at the office, I couldn't escape the whispers. My coworkers knew something was wrong. They could see the sadness in my eyes, the way I flinched at every mention of relationships or marriage. Friends and family reached out, offering support and a shoulder to cry on. My parents were devastated when they found out, and my mom, in particular, was furious with Alex. She'd always adored him, treated him like a son, and couldn't believe that he'd betrayed me in such a profound way. I felt guilty for dragging everyone into the mess, but I also needed them more than ever. I needed to know that I wasn't alone, that I had people who loved me, even when everything else was falling apart. The impact of Alex's affair extended far beyond our marriage. It affected every aspect of my life, from my friendships to my sense of self-worth. I found myself withdrawing from social events, avoiding gatherings where I knew people would ask how I was doing. I couldn't bear the thought of answering questions, of seeing the pity in their eyes. I felt embarrassed, like I'd failed in some fundamental way. I also struggled with a constant loop of self-doubt and questioning. Was there something I'd missed? Had I been too trusting, too naive? I replayed our last few months together over and over, searching for clues that might have hinted at what was happening. I berated myself for not seeing it sooner, for believing that our marriage was unbreakable. Sleep became a struggle. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and feeling the weight of everything I'd lost. The nights were the worst, the quiet, empty hours where there was nothing to distract me from the pain. I'd think about Alex and Rena, about the life they'd shared in Tokyo, and I'd feel a mix of anger, jealousy, and deep sadness. I knew that Alex had made a mistake, but it didn't make the hurt any less real. The betrayal also made me question my future. Alex and I had talked about starting a family one day, but now those dreams felt impossibly distant. I couldn't imagine having children with someone who had broken my trust so completely. I couldn't imagine building a life with someone who had proven that I wasn't enough. It felt like everything I'd been working toward, every plan we'd made, had been ripped away in an instant. Alex, for his part, was trying desperately to make amends. He stopped traveling, turned down promotions that would require him to be away, and did everything he could to show me that he was committed to making things work. He was patient, kind, and attentive in a way he hadn't been in years, but it all felt too little, too late. I wanted to believe that he was sincere, that he was willing to change, but my heart wasn't ready to trust him again. We continued therapy, but it felt like we were just going through the motions. Our sessions were filled with apologies, tears, and attempts to rebuild the connection we'd lost, but the wound was still too fresh. I'd sit across from Alex, listening to him talk about his remorse, but all I could think about was the lies he'd told and the moments we'd never get back. One day, after a particularly difficult session, our therapist asked me a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Do you think you can forgive him? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to forgive him, I wanted to believe that we could find our way back to each other, but the reality was that I didn't know if I could. The pain was too deep, the trust too shattered. I'd spent so long trying to hold on to the idea of what our marriage could be, but the truth was, I didn't know if that version of us existed anymore. As the months went on, I found myself at a crossroads. I was tired of feeling stuck, tired of living in a state of limbo where nothing felt certain. I knew that I couldn't keep going like this, holding on to a relationship that felt like a shadow of what it once was. But the thought of letting go was just as terrifying. One evening, Alex came home with a surprise: tickets to Tokyo. He said it was his way of making amends, of showing me that he was serious about moving forward and creating new memories together. He'd planned everything: a week of sightseeing, staying in a beautiful hotel, and experiencing the city that had caused so much pain. I stared at the tickets, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. The last place I wanted to go was Tokyo. I couldn't imagine walking the same streets, eating at the same restaurants, and trying to enjoy a trip that was tainted by betrayal. It felt like a cruel joke, like he was asking me to relive the worst moment of my life. "I can't do this," I said, pushing the tickets back toward him. "I don't want to go there. I don't want to pretend that everything's okay." Alex looked heartbroken, his shoulders slumping as he realized how much he'd miscalculated. "I just thought, maybe it could be a fresh start." "A fresh start doesn't mean going back to where it all went wrong," I replied, my voice trembling. "I don't think I can ever feel the same way again." We sat in silence, both of us grappling with the weight of what our marriage had become. I wanted so badly to fix things, to go back to the way we were before, but the reality was, that wasn't possible. The trust was gone, and no amount of grand gestures could bring it back. In the weeks that followed, we continued therapy, but it was clear that we were drifting further apart. I started looking at apartments, needing a space that was mine, away from the memories of what we'd lost. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but I knew that staying together out of fear or obligation wasn't fair to either of us. Eventually, we agreed to separate. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, there were no screaming matches or ultimatums. It was a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that our marriage was no longer what it once was. Alex moved out, and I stayed in the house, trying to figure out how to start over. The first few months after Alex left were some of the hardest of my life. I felt lost, heartbroken, and unsure of who I was without him. I'd spent so much of my adult life as Alex's wife, and now I had to figure out who I was on my own. I leaned heavily on my friends and family, who were my lifeline during those dark days. They reminded me that I was strong, that I deserved better, and that it was okay to take things one day at a time. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and pushing myself to excel. I started staying late at the office, not just because I wanted to avoid going home, but because I found solace in my work. I rediscovered my passion for design, pouring my emotions into every project and using my creativity as a way to process my pain. My boss noticed the change in me, and soon I was promoted to lead a major campaign that would define the company's brand for the next year. It was the validation I needed, a reminder that I was still capable, still talented, and still worthy of success. I also started going to therapy on my own, working through the emotions that had been weighing me down. I talked about the betrayal, the anger, and the sense of loss that had consumed me for so long. My therapist helped me see that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about finding a way to move forward without letting the past define me. I began making changes to the house, turning it into a space that felt like mine. I painted the walls in bright, cheerful colors, bought new furniture, and filled the rooms with things that brought me joy. I created a cozy reading nook by the window, where I'd spend hours lost in books that took me far away from my reality. I hung up photos of my friends, my travels, and moments that made me feel alive. It was my way of reclaiming my space, of taking back the life that Alex's affair had tried to steal from me. I also reconnected with old hobbies that I'd neglected over the years. I started hiking again, spending weekends exploring trails and finding solace in nature. There was something therapeutic about being outside, surrounded by trees and fresh air, that helped clear my mind and remind me of the beauty in the world. I joined a book club, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for, and found joy in discussing stories with a group of like-minded women. It felt good to rediscover the parts of myself that I'd lost along the way. And then, slowly but surely, I started to think about dating again. It was terrifying, the idea of opening myself up to someone new after everything I'd been through. I worried that I'd never be able to trust anyone again, that I'd always be looking for signs of betrayal. But I knew I couldn't let my past dictate my future. I didn't want to be defined by Alex's mistakes, I wanted to write my own story. I went on a few dates, some good, some awkward, but each one was a step toward rebuilding my confidence. I learned to enjoy the process of getting to know new people, of exploring connections without any pressure. I wasn't in a rush to find someone new, I was just enjoying the journey of rediscovery. I found that I was stronger than I'd ever realized, and that there was a whole world of possibilities waiting for me. It's been over a year since I found out about Alex's affair, and while the pain has lessened, the experience has forever changed me. I'm still in the process of healing, still learning how to trust again, and still figuring out what I want my life to look like. But I'm getting there, one day at a time. Alex and I have stayed in touch, but our relationship is now one of cordial distance. We've both moved on in our own ways, and while there will always be a part of me that wishes things had turned out differently, I'm grateful for the lessons I've learned. I've realized that I deserve honesty, respect, and someone who values me enough to never take me for granted. I've also learned to forgive, not just Alex, but myself. I've forgiven myself for the days when I couldn't get out of bed, for the moments when I doubted my worth, and for all the times I questioned what I could have done differently. I've learned that healing is messy, imperfect, and doesn't have a timeline. And most importantly, I've learned that I am enough, just as I am. I've started setting new goals for myself, traveling more, focusing on my health, and pursuing passions that I'd put on hold. I'm no longer defined by my past, and I'm excited about the future, whatever it may hold. I've found strength in my independence, in the knowledge that I can weather any storm, and in the belief that better days are ahead. I've even started planning a solo trip, a journey to a place I've always wanted to see, not to run away from my past, but to celebrate how far I've come. I'm excited about the adventure, the freedom, and the chance to explore the world on my own terms. It's a trip that's just for me, and for the first time in a long time, I feel truly at peace with where I am. To anyone out there going through something similar, just know that you're not alone. It's okay to feel hurt, to be angry, and to take time to heal. But don't let someone else's choices define your worth. You are strong, resilient, and deserving of a love that lifts you up, not tears you down. Reddit update, the aftermath. OP, my husband cheated with a girl from Japan on a business trip. Hey everyone, I just wanted to give an update and say thank you for all the support and advice you've given me over the past year. It's been a long and painful journey, but I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. Alex and I have gone our separate ways, and while it was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, I know it was the right one. I've been focusing on myself, my career, and rebuilding my life on my own terms. I'm rediscovering passions I'd forgotten, setting new goals, and learning to be happy on my own. I'm not rushing into anything, but I'm open to whatever the future holds. Thank you again to everyone who took the time to comment, offer support, and share your own stories. It's helped more than you know. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that we are so much stronger than we give ourselves credit for. Keep moving forward, and don't ever settle for less than you deserve.